before we dive into today's mystery, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep uncovering the unknown. Now, let's begin. You'll beg to leave, but we won't let you. That's what the contract said. David Parker thought it was just part of the show, a marketing gimmick meant to scare thrill seekers. After all, he had seen the videos. People screaming, crying, shaking uncontrollably. Some vomited. Others were so disoriented they couldn't even form words. But they had agreed to it. They had signed their names on the dotted line, knowing full well that McKamey Manor was no ordinary haunted house. David had always considered himself fearless. A former Marine, he had endured real combat, slept in trenches, and watched men die. What could possibly scare him? He had laughed when his friends warned him. He had even rolled his eyes at the so-called survivors, who spoke about McKamey Manor as if they had escaped a war zone. So when he arrived at the secluded property in rural Tennessee, his confidence was unwavering. That confidence shattered within the first 10 minutes. The invitation you can't resist. It all started with a video. McKamey Manor's website looked like something out of a horror movie. Black and white footage of gagged participants convulsing in terror, faces covered in blood and filth. Grainy night vision shots showed them bound with duct tape, submerged in water, screaming for mercy. At the center of it all was Russ McKamey, the puppet master behind the madness. He was an older man, wiry, with a chilling grin that seemed permanently etched onto his face. He spoke with the confidence of a man who knew he controlled everything. "You think you can handle it?" he would ask in his recruitment videos, smirking at the camera. "I promise you, this will be the worst experience of your life." That was the hook. McKamey Manor wasn't just a haunted house. It was a test of survival. No ghosts, no actors in cheap costumes, no predictable jump scares. This was real psychological warfare. And the kicker? No one had ever made it to the end. David took the bait. The application process was strangely thorough. He had to provide a full medical clearance, prove he was physically and mentally sound, and sign a 40-page waiver that absolved McKamey of any responsibility for injury, trauma, or death. It should have been a red flag. It wasn't. David was too focused on the challenge. When David arrived at the remote, decaying property, he expected a haunted house, maybe some stage horror scenarios, intense but ultimately controlled. Instead, he found Russ McKamey himself, waiting with a video camera. "Look at this guy." Russ chuckled, circling David like a vulture. "Tough guy, huh? You won't last an hour." David smirked. "Try me?" Russ's grin widened. "Oh, I intend to." There was no easing into it. The moment the game began, David was ambushed. Hands grabbed him from behind. Several people in black hoods, their faces obscured. A sack was shoved over his head, his arms wrenched behind his back, duct tape binding his wrists. His feet left the ground. Before he could react, he was being dragged across gravel, the sharp stone slicing through his jeans, biting into his skin. Then darkness. A freezing splash of water ripped the breath from his lungs. The sack was torn off. He was in a metal tub filled with ice water, hands still bound. His body shocked, trembling violently. Russ stood over him, holding a camera. "Welcome to McKamey Manor." David gasped for air, but two hands shoved his head under. The realization hit him with an icy clarity. This wasn't just a game. This was torture. David had read the waiver, but he had skimmed through it. He assumed it was like any extreme sport liability form. He was wrong. The waiver explicitly stated they could pull out his teeth, they could shave his head, pour chemicals on his skin, they could submerge him, slap him, cut his clothes off, they could break his bones. They did not have to stop even if he begged them to. He had signed his rights away. Every scream, every desperate plea, it meant nothing. The worst part? Russ McKamey never physically touched him. He just filmed it all, laughing, whispering things like, "You asked for this, buddy." The torment continued. It wasn't a haunted house. It was a horror movie brought to life. Blindfolded and buried in dirt. Insects crawling over his skin. His mouth forced open. Something rancid shoved inside. A mixture of blood, rotten eggs, and raw meat. His fingernails bent backwards, each snap sending a bolt of agony up his arm. Loud screams in his ear, disorienting, making him lose all sense of time. He lost track of reality. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. There was no safe word. No way out. Only Russ's voice, mocking him through the darkness. "You're tough, right? Let's see how tough." At some point, David stopped resisting. He had no strength left to fight. His mind fractured, slipping between lucid terror and numbing submission. That's when Russ turned up the horror. A mirror was placed in front of him. He saw his own face, swollen, bloody, unrecognizable. A coffin was brought out. Ever wonder what it feels like to be buried alive? David was sealed inside. The air was tight, the darkness absolute. His lungs screamed for oxygen. His mind screamed for freedom. And then silence. No voices. No cameras. Only his heartbeat hammering like a war drum. Then the dirt began falling. Would he make it out? Or would he become another nameless casualty of the world's most twisted haunted house? The dirt kept falling. David could feel the weight pressing down on his chest, each grain like a coffin nail sealing his fate. His fingers clawed at the wood above him, but there was no room to move. No air. No hope. His heartbeat pounded in his skull, growing erratic. His lungs screamed for oxygen, but there was none left to take. Is this how I die? Then laughter. Muffled, distorted, but undeniably Russ McKamey's voice. "You thought I'd actually kill you? You're not that lucky, buddy." A sudden rush of air. Hands ripped open the coffin, yanked him out. Dirt spilled onto the ground, his body convulsing as he gasped for breath. The world spun. He felt weightless. Then a fist slammed into his stomach. He hit the ground, coughing up soil. Russ loomed over him, camera in hand. His expression was pure amusement. "Still think you're tough?" David couldn't answer. He was past words now. His body wasn't his own. It was just pain. But there was something else. Something worse. A flickering red light. A camera lens. Not just one. Several. Russ wasn't just recording. He was broadcasting. Through the haze, David saw something he hadn't noticed before. A row of monitors. Dark figures watching from somewhere else. Russ followed his gaze and smirked. "Oh, you noticed? Huh? Well, let's just say you've got an audience." David's stomach twisted. Who was watching? The horrors of McKamey Manor weren't just for Russ's entertainment. They were being streamed. Sold. For who? People who wanted to see suffering. People who enjoyed watching men and women break. "I'm not getting out of here, am I?" That's when David felt the needle. A sharp pinprick in his neck. The world tilted. Darkness swallowed him whole. David woke up chained to a chair. His head was foggy. His muscles wouldn't respond. The room around him was different. Not part of the haunted house, but something deeper inside. Someone no cameras could see. Russ sat in front of him, drinking from a coffee mug. Calm, collected, like he was just starting his day. "You're doing great, Dave." He grinned. Not many make it this far. David's lips parted. His voice was barely a whisper. "Let me go." Russ leaned in, eyes glowed with something unholy. "Why would I do that? You haven't even given me a good scream yet." He snapped his fingers. A hooded figure appeared behind David. A hand yanked his head back. A blade pressed against his cheek. Slow. Testing. "Let's fix that, huh?" David closed his eyes. This wasn't a game anymore. This was worship. McKamey Manor wasn't about fear. It was about submission. Russ didn't want screams. He wanted control. Somewhere, far away from this hellhole, people had tried to shut McKamey Manor down. Hundreds of complaints. Victims who had left with broken bones, lost teeth, nerve damage. Petitions with thousands of signatures calling it legalized torture. But no matter how many people tried to stop him, McKamey Manor kept running. Why? Because of that 40-page waiver. Every single person who walked through those gates signed away their rights. Every bruise, every broken rib, every moment of hell, they had agreed to it. The police couldn't interfere. No laws were technically broken. Russ knew exactly where the line was, and he danced on the edge of it with a smile. Even when survivors went to the authorities, the response was always the same. You signed the contract. David had signed it too, which meant no one was coming to save him. But something was different now. David wasn't the only one trapped. There were others, and one of them was watching him. A woman, her face bruised, her eyes hollow. She was half hidden in the shadows, but when their gazes met, he saw it, the tiniest spark. Hope. She whispered something, a single word. Tonight. David's pulse quickened. There was a plan. Russ didn't know it yet. But the monsters weren't the only ones hunting tonight. David's heart pounded. Tonight. The word echoed in his mind. The woman, her bruised face half hidden in the darkness, had said it so softly, it barely registered. But in this place, where hope had been suffocated to a whisper, it was a scream. He wasn't alone. Others were here, and they were planning something. But how? Russ McKamey's operation was airtight. Every part of McKamey Manor was controlled, calculated, locked down. The torment was designed to break people so completely they wouldn't have the strength or the will to fight back. David barely had either. But that one word, tonight, was enough to light a fire in his broken body. He nodded at the woman. She blinked once. A silent understanding. Something was coming. And if he wanted to survive, he had to be ready. You're looking better, Dave. Russ's voice slithered into the room like a snake. David's stomach tightened. Russ never spoke casually. If he was here, it meant a new game was beginning. Two hooded figures dragged David forward, shoving him into a metal chair. A single, dim light flickered above him, casting long shadows across the room. And then he saw it, a rusted, blood-stained cage. Inside it, the woman. She was bound at the wrists, her arms trembling. Russ grinned, setting his camera down with a satisfied sigh. This wasn't a haunted house anymore. This was a gladiator pit. Here's the deal, buddy. Russ crouched in front of David, his smile as cold as the steel around him. I'll give you a choice. He motioned toward a table beside them. Two objects lay on it, a knife and a rusted key. You take the knife, you get to walk away after you finish her off. David's stomach twisted. Or you take the key, let her go. But if you do that, I promise you, Russ's smile widened, you won't make it out of here alive. Asterisk. David's breath shuddered. It was a test of control. Russ wanted to see if he was broken enough to turn on someone else, to become another animal in this house of horror. The woman's eyes met his. Terrified, pleading. She had whispered tonight. That meant there was a plan. David clenched his fists. He knew his choice. He just had to survive long enough to make it matter. David lunged for the key. Russ's laughter cut through the air like a blade. Oh, I knew you'd be the hero. Before David's fingers could close around it, something slammed into the side of his head. Stars exploded in his vision. His body hit the ground, pain flaring through his ribs. The guards were on him. Heavy boots stomped against his back, pinning him down. Bad choice, buddy. Russ's voice was thick with amusement. You just made this a lot more fun. David barely registered the next few moments. Fists, shouting, blood spilling onto the floor. Then a sharp snap. The lights cut out. Chaos erupted. A sudden, violent crash rang through the manor. Someone screamed. Then another sound, guttural. Pained, David felt the weight lift off his back. A voice hissed in his ear. Move. Now. The woman. She was free, and she wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows. Other captives. Beaten, bruised, but not broken. And they had a plan. Russ McKamey had underestimated them. For years, he had tortured people, but he had never faced real resistance. Until now, David staggered to his feet, adrenaline dulling his pain. In the dark, Russ was scrambling. His carefully controlled nightmare was falling apart. Get the cameras back on, he shouted. But his guards? They were gone. Some of the captives had turned on them. There was fighting in the halls. Screams, crashing sounds, the sharp snap of something breaking. David grabbed the woman's wrist. Which way? She pointed toward a door. Back exit. It's locked, but... A loud bang. Then a piercing alarm. Russ had hit the emergency switch. The whole compound was sealing shut. David's mind raced. They were out of time. Then he saw it, one of the monitors still flickering, and his blood ran cold. The feed was still broadcasting. But not just here. The police were watching. Russ McKamey had always been careful. Too careful. He never let his game slip outside the walls of the manor. He operated in the shadows, bending laws without ever breaking them. But tonight, the survivors had turned his own game against him. The cameras weren't just streaming to the sick monsters who watched from the dark web. They were broadcasting the world. The manor's secrets, every brutal moment, every scream, every broken body, were being recorded and sent straight to law enforcement. David saw it on Russ's face. For the first time, he looked afraid. Sirens, distant at first, then louder, closer. Russ ran. David and the others didn't stop. They burst through the back door just as the first police cars skidded onto the property. Armed officers poured into the manor, and behind them, dozens of cameras, news crews. The whole world was watching. McKamey Manor was finished. McKamey Manor was shut down, not because of legal loopholes, but because the truth was undeniable. Survivors spoke out. Footage leaked. Public outrage forced action. Russ McKamey vanished. Some say he fled the country. Others believe someone got to him before the law did. But the manor was gone. David never fully recovered. Some scars don't fade. Some nightmares don't end. But he learned something. Monsters thrive in the dark, but they fall when people fight back.